The vehicle's ready for refrigerant recovery. A system performance analysis has been completed and refrigerant identification has been performed. Remove keys from the vehicle ignition. Clean and leak test around the service port caps, then remove. Place the manifold with attached hoses, couplers and isolation valve. Ensure gauge manifold taps are shut and gauges are calibrated to 0. Connect the blue coupler to the low side service. Open the blue coupler until the blue gauge shows the system pressure. Connect the red coupler to the high side service port. Open the red coupler until the red gauge shows the system pressure. Place the recovery unit with the yellow hose attached and an isolation valve fitted. Connect the isolation valve on the charging hose to the recovery unit's suction port. Place a pump down or reclaim cylinder on a set of scales. Connect the charging hose from the recovery unit discharge through an isolation valve to the refrigerant cylinder. Zero out the scale. Open the low side manifold valve. Open the high side manifold. Open the isolation valve on the charging hose to the recovery unit. Switch the recovery unit to recover position. Open the recovery unit suction valve. The recovery unit gauges will now read the system pressure. Open the recovery unit discharge valve. Open the isolation valve and purge the hose to the refrigerant cylinder. Open the refrigerant cylinder. Switch the recovery unit on. The red recovery unit gauge will now read the output pressure. Watch the blue recovery unit gauge until it reads -10 kPa. The blue gauge should also be reading -10 kPa and the red gauge will be showing 0. Close the low side manifold and close the high side manifold. Switch the recovery unit. Wait for a minimum of 5 minutes, dependent upon the system size and ambient temperature, to check that the system pressure doesn't rise above 0 kPa. Check the low side gauge on the manifold after the elapsed period of time. If it has arisen above 0 kPa, you'll need to do some more recovery. If it hasn't moved, you're ready to continue. Where fitted, switch to self-clear. Switch the recovery unit. This will clear any refrigerant out of the suction pipes and pump. Once the blue gauge goes below 0, turn the unit off. Close the recovery unit suction valve. Close the recovery unit discharge valve. Close the refrigerant cylinder valve. Close the isolation valve on the yellow charge hose to the recovery and close the isolation valve on the yellow charge hose to the recovery. Record the reading on the scale. You can now safely undertake the service required with the knowledge that no refrigerant pressure remains in. The system has had refrigerant removed and appropriately stored, and works have been carried out on the system. We need to ensure there are no leaks in. Place a nitrogen bottle. Attach a regulator to the nitrogen bottle. Ensure the regulator valve is wound out completely. Disconnect the charging hose with the isolation valve from the recovery unit's suction valve and attach to the nitrogen regulator outlet connector. Close the blue coupler. Ensure the low pressure manifold valve is closed. Slowly open the nitrogen cylinder valve a quarter turn only. The inside regulator gauge will show the cylinder pressure. Screw in the regulator valve to the desired test pressure. This will read on the outside regulator gauge. Slowly open the charge line isolation valve. Open the red valve on the manifold. The red gauge will start to rise as nitrogen enters the cylinder. Watch the red gauge until it reaches the desired test pressure. Perform leak tests on recently replaced or repaired components. This will always include a new receiver dryer. Close the nitrogen cylinder valve. Perform a drop test as follows. Close the red valve on the manifold. Now wait for a period of time as specified in Refrigerant Handling Code of Practice. Check the red gauge on the manifold after the elapsed period of time. If the gauge has fallen, the test has failed. Look for a leak. If the gauge is unchanged, the test has passed and you can continue. Close the charging hose isolation valve and disconnect the charging hose from the regulator. Wind out the regulator valve. Open the red valve on the manifold and slowly open the isolation valve of the yellow charging hose. Nitrogen from the system will vent into the atmosphere. The red gauge will read 0 kPa when all nitrogen is released. Close the charging hose isolation. The pressure leak test is completed. The system has passed the pressure test and is no longer at pressure as confirmed by the manifold gauges. Where appropriate, PP. Close the high and low service couplers. Ensure both manifold valves are closed. Disconnect the low side manifold hose from the low side coupler. Connect a T-piece and vacuum gauge to the low side coupler. Connect the low side manifold hose to the T-piece. Switch on the digital vacuum gauge and set the measurement units. Place a vacuum pump. Check the pump oil for level and condition. Attach a charging hose through an isolation valve to the vacuum pump inlet. Turn on and operate the vacuum pump in accordance with the manufacturer's instruction. Open the charging hose isolation valve. Open the low side manifold valve fully. Observe that both the vacuum gauge and the low side manifold gauge begin to display a dropping pressure. Open the low side coupler. And open the high side coupler. The high side manifold gauge begins to display a reducing pressure, confirming complete system evacuation is occurring. Open the high side manifold valve fully. Run the vacuum pump for a minimum of 30 minutes after the vacuum gauge indicates a vacuum pressure of 200 to 500 microns. Close the low pressure manifold valve and close the high pressure manifold valve. Close the charge hose isolation valve. Perform a vacuum hold test as per the AACOP. A pressure increase in excess of 100 microns indicates a leak or moisture in the system. The fault must be rectified. Ensure no leaks are present and repeat evacuation procedure until the required result is achieved. If the pressure does not rise by more than 100 microns, you may continue. Close the low side coupler. Disconnect the low side hose from the T-piece. Disconnect the vacuum gauge and T-piece from the low side coupler. Reconnect the low side hose to the coupler. Open the low pressure manifold valve and charge hose isolation valve. The vacuum pump will now evacuate the hose and manifold. Close the low pressure manifold valve and charge hose isolation valve. Switch off the vacuum pump and the evacuation is complete. The system is now ready for charge. The system has been evacuated and is now ready for charging. When handling refrigerant, wear appropriate PPE. Disconnect the charging hose, including the isolation valve, from the vacuum pump. Place a reclaim cylinder or new refrigerant cylinder on the scales. Attach the charging hose with isolation valve to the refrigerant cylinder. Please note, in this simulation we're not distinguishing between liquid or gas charging, which is a very important part of the charging process. Refer to the vehicle manufacturer's instructions. Open the low side coupler. Ensure the low side manifold valve is closed. And ensure the high side manifold valve is closed. Open the refrigerant cylinder valve. Momentarily purge the charging hose isolation valve to the cylinder valve connection. Zero the charging scales. Open the charging hose isolation valve. Open the high side manifold valve to commence the charging process. The low and high side gauges will indicate refrigerant pressure. Allow the full refrigerant charge to enter the system. Close the high side manifold valve. If the system and refrigerant cylinder pressures equalise prior to the full charge entering the system shall be operated to complete the charging process as follows. Ensure the vehicle is in park or neutral with the park brake set. Start the vehicle engine. Turn the air conditioning system on and set a high fan speed, maximum cooling, through the face vents. The manifold gauges should now indicate the low and high side operating pressures respectively. Throttle open the low side manifold valve, maintaining the low side gauge pressure at not more than 300 kPa until the remaining charge has entered the system. Close the low side manifold valve. Close the refrigerant cylinder valve. And close the charge hose isolation valve. Run the system to confirm the system is performing to specification. Close the high side coupler. Open the high side manifold valve and slowly open the low side manifold valve. Operate the system until both manifold gauges indicate the system low side pressure to ensure the entire refrigerant charge is drawn into the system, leaving the minimum refrigerant in the manifold and hose set. Close both manifold valves. Close the low side coupler and turn off the vehicle engine. Disconnect couplers and hoses from the vehicle and refrigerant cylinder. Park the hoses with closed couplers and isolation valve on the manifold to prevent their contamination and refrigerant escaping to the atmosphere. Replace system service port caps and refrigerant cylinder valve sealing cap. Leak test the system as per the AACOP. Apply system service label as per the AACOP. And the process is complete.